When I inherited Grandpa's farm last spring, I thought I knew every inch of the property. I'd spent countless summers here as a kid, helping with chores and listening to his stories about working the land. But there was one field I'd never really paid attention to, the back 40 acres that had been left fallow for as long as I could remember. Grandpa always said that field was resting, that the soil needed time to recover. As a child, I'd accepted this explanation without question. Now at 28 and suddenly responsible for 200 acres of farmland, I decided it was time to bring that field back into production. The field sat at the far end of the property, separated from the main farm by a line of oak trees and an old stone wall. When I first walked out there in early October, I was surprised by how wild it had become. What should have been open farmland was now covered in tall grass, brambles and volunteer trees that had sprouted over the decades. But the soil looked rich and dark beneath the overgrowth, and I could see the remnants of old furrows that suggested this had once been productive farmland. I spent a week clearing the worst of the brush by hand, cutting down saplings and burning piles of dead vegetation. My plan was simple: use the old John Deere to plow the field, then disc it smooth and plant winter wheat. It should have been straightforward work, the kind of thing I'd done dozens of times on other parts of the farm. I had no reason to expect that this field would be any different from the others. Looking back now, I realize there were signs I should have noticed. The way my grandfather's face would change whenever someone mentioned that field. How he'd always found excuses to keep me away from that part of the property. The fact that no cattle had ever grazed there despite the good grass. But I was focused on the future, not the past. Chapter 2. The Soft Ground. I started plowing on a crisp Monday morning in late October. The old John Deere fired up without complaint, and I began working the field in long, straight rows. The first few passes went smoothly, the plow cutting through the sod and turning over rich, black earth that hadn't seen sunlight in decades. The soil was softer than I'd expected, which I attributed to all the organic matter that had built up over the years. The decomposed grass and leaves had created a thick layer of humus that made the ground almost spongy in places. It was actually ideal for farming, the kind of soil that would grow anything you planted in it. I was about halfway through the field when I noticed the tractor starting to sink slightly with each pass. At first, I thought it was just the weight of the machine compacting the soft earth. But as I continued working, the sinking became more pronounced. The rear wheels were leaving deeper and deeper tracks, and I could feel the tractor working harder to maintain traction. By noon, I was having to use four-wheel drive just to keep moving forward. The ground seemed to be getting softer rather than firmer as I worked it. I'd never encountered anything quite like it. Usually, plowing packed the soil down and made it more stable, not less. I decided to take a break for lunch and let the ground dry out a bit. Maybe the morning dew had made things worse than they actually were, but when I returned an hour later, the situation hadn't improved. If anything, the field seemed even more unstable. I should have stopped then. Should have recognized that something wasn't right about this particular piece of ground, but I was determined to finish what I'd started, and I convinced myself that I just needed to be more careful about where I drove the tractor. That decision would change everything. Chapter 3. It happened on my third pass after lunch. I was working along the eastern edge of the field when the ground simply gave way beneath the tractor's rear wheels. One moment I was moving forward normally, the next I was tilted at a steep angle with the back end of the John Deere sunk nearly to the axles, in what felt like quicksand. I tried rocking the tractor back and forth, alternating between forward and reverse, but that only made things worse. The wheels spun uselessly, throwing up sprays of dark, wet earth that had an odd, almost oily consistency. The more I tried to free the machine, the deeper it sank. After 20 minutes of futile effort, I shut off the engine and climbed down to assess the situation. The rear wheels had disappeared completely into the soft ground, and the back of the tractor was sitting on what appeared to be solid earth, but felt disturbingly unstable when I stepped on it. I walked around the stuck machine, trying to figure out the best way to extract it. I'd need to call my neighbor Jim, who had a bigger tractor that might be able to pull the John Deere free. But first, I wanted to understand what I was dealing with. I grabbed a long stick from the edge of the field and began probing the ground around the tractor. What I found made no sense. The soil was firm for the first foot or so, then became increasingly soft until the stick met no resistance at all. It was as if there was a void beneath the surface, filled with loose, wet earth. I pushed the stick deeper, expecting to hit bedrock or clay hardpan. Instead, it sank 4 feet, then 5, then 6 feet before I ran out of stick. Whatever was down there, it wasn't natural soil formation. That's when I decided to start digging. Chapter 4. The First Discovery. I went back to the barn and got a shovel, along with some boards to stand on, so I wouldn't sink into the soft ground myself. Working carefully, I began excavating around the tractor's rear wheels, trying to create a stable platform that would allow me to attach a tow chain. The earth came up easily, too easily. It was dark and rich, but it had a strange texture that didn't feel quite right. Mixed in with the soil were fragments of what looked like fabric, so rotted and stained that I couldn't identify what they might have been originally. About 2 feet down, my shovel hit something solid. At first, I thought it might be a rock or an old piece of farm equipment. But as I cleared away more dirt, I realized I was looking at something white and curved, something that looked disturbingly like bone. I stopped digging and stared at the object, my heart beginning to race. It could be an animal bone, I told myself. Farmers had been burying dead livestock on their property for generations. There was probably a perfectly innocent explanation for what I was seeing. But even as I tried to rationalize the discovery, I knew I was looking at something human. The size and shape were wrong for any farm animal I could think of. And there was something else. Other white objects visible in the dark earth around it, arranged in a way that suggested they were connected. I sat back on my heels, suddenly feeling sick. I'd thought about my grandfather, about his strange reluctance to use this field, about the way he'd always changed the subject when anyone asked about it. Had he known what was buried here? Had he been protecting this secret for decades? My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone to call the sheriff's department, but before I could dial, I heard something that made my blood freeze, the sound of a car engine coming up the farm road. Someone was coming, and I was alone in a field with what appeared to be human remains. Chapter 5. Unexpected Visitor. The car that pulled up to the edge of the field was a black sedan I didn't recognize. An elderly man got out, moving slowly but with purpose. He was well dressed despite the rural setting, wearing a clean button-down shirt and pressed slacks that seemed out of place on a working farm. He walked toward me with the careful steps of someone navigating unfamiliar terrain, his eyes fixed on the excavation around my tractor. As he got closer, I could see that his face was pale and drawn, as if he hadn't slept well in years. "You found them," he said simply when he reached the edge of my digging area. It wasn't a question. I stood up slowly, still holding the shovel, my mind racing. "Found what? Who are you?" The man looked at me with sad, tired eyes. "My name is Robert Chen. I've been waiting 43 years for someone to find this place." He gestured toward the bones visible in the dark earth. "That's my daughter, Linda. She was 19 when she disappeared." The words hit me like a physical blow. I looked down at the remains, then back at the old man. "Your daughter? But how do you know? How did you know to come here?" Robert Chen pulled a folded newspaper clipping from his wallet. The paper was yellowed with age, but I could make out the headline, "Local Girl Missing After Halloween Party." The accompanying photo showed a young Asian woman with a bright smile and long black hair. "Linda went to a party on October 31st, 1980, he said quietly. "She was supposed to come home that night, but she never made it. The police investigated, but they said she probably ran away. Said girls her age did that sometimes." His voice carried decades of pain and frustration. "But you didn't believe that," I said. "Linda was a good girl. She was studying to be a nurse, had plans for her future. She wouldn't have just disappeared without telling us." He looked around the field, taking in the overgrown landscape. I always suspected she'd been murdered, but I never knew where to look. Then how did you know to come here today? Robert Chen's expression grew even more grim. Because I've been watching this farm for 40 years, waiting for someone to disturb this field. Chapter 6. The Watcher. Robert Chen's revelation that he'd been watching the farm for 4 decades sent a chill down my spine. I looked around the isolated field, suddenly feeling very exposed and vulnerable. The nearest neighbor was half a mile away, and my cell phone showed only 1 bar of signal. "You've been watching us?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Not watching you personally," he clarified. "Watching the field. I knew Linda was somewhere on this property, and I knew that someday someone would find her." He pulled out a small notebook, its pages filled with dates and observations written in careful handwriting. "I've documented every time anyone came near this field for the past 40 years, he continued. "Your grandfather never let anyone work it, never let cattle graze here, never even let hunters cross it during deer season. He was protecting something, and I was pretty sure I knew what it was." The implications of what he was saying began to sink in. "You think my grandfather killed your daughter?" Robert Chen was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. "I think your grandfather knew who killed my daughter. Whether he was involved directly or just helped cover it up, I don't know. But he's been guarding this secret his whole life." I thought about my grandfather, the kind, gentle man who had taught me to fish and farm, who had never raised his voice or shown any sign of violence. The idea that he could be connected to a murder seemed impossible. "There has to be another explanation," I said. "Maybe he didn't know what was buried here. Maybe someone else used his land without permission." But even as I said it, I knew it didn't make sense. My grandfather had known every inch of this farm. He would have noticed if someone had been digging graves in his field. Robert Chen opened his notebook and showed me pages of meticulous records. Dates, times, weather conditions, and detailed notes about any activity on the farm. It was the work of someone obsessed, someone who had dedicated his life to finding the truth about his daughter's disappearance. "I need to call the police," I said, pulling out my phone. "Wait," Robert Chen said urgently. "There's something else you need to know first." Chapter 7. More Than One. Robert Chen's words stopped me from dialing 911. He was looking at the excavation around my tractor with an expression that was both sad and determined. "Linda wasn't the only one," he said quietly. "There were 3 other girls who disappeared from our area between 1978 and 1982. All young women, all found reasons to be out alone at night. All vanished without a trace." He showed me more newspaper clippings from his wallet, yellowed articles about missing persons cases that had never been solved. Sarah Martinez, age 20, disappeared after leaving work at a local diner. Jennifer Walsh, 18, vanished while walking home from a friend's house. Maria Santos, 19, last seen leaving a church social. "The police said they were probably runaways," Robert continued. "Said young women sometimes just decided to start new lives somewhere else. But I knew better. These girls had families who loved them, futures they were excited about. They didn't just run away." I stared at the clippings, trying to process what he was telling me. "You think they're all buried here?" "I think this field is a cemetery," he said grimly. "And I think your grandfather was either the killer or he was protecting whoever was." The thought made me sick. I looked around the 40-acre field with new eyes, wondering how many graves might be hidden beneath the overgrown grass and weeds. How many families had spent decades wondering what happened to their daughters. "We need to call the FBI," I said. "If this is what you think it is, it's way beyond local police." But Robert Chen shook his head. "Not yet. If we call in law enforcement now, they'll seal off the entire property, and we might never get answers. I've been waiting 43 years to find out what happened to Linda. I need to know the truth before the lawyers and bureaucrats take over." I understood his frustration, but I also knew we were in over our heads. "We can't just start digging up bodies on our own. That's tampering with evidence." "Then let's just look around a little more," he suggested. "See if we can find any other obvious burial sites before we make the call. Once the authorities take over, we'll be shut out completely." "No, Against my better judgment, I found myself agreeing. The need to understand what had happened on my family's land was overwhelming. I had to know how deep this secret went. We spent the next hour walking the field systematically, looking for any signs of disturbance in the soil. Chapter 8. The Pattern. What we found was worse than I had imagined. Using a long metal rod to probe the ground, we discovered at least 6 areas where the soil was significantly softer than the surrounding earth. The spots were scattered across the field, but seemed to follow a rough pattern. All were located near the tree line, in areas that would have been hidden from view of the main farm buildings. Each soft spot was roughly the same size, about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. The dimensions of graves. Robert Chen marked each location with a small flag from his car, creating a grim map of what appeared to be a killing field that had been active for several years. His hands shook as he placed each marker, and I could see tears in his eyes. 43 years, he whispered, as we stood looking at the flags scattered across the field. 43 years I've been wondering where she was, and she was here the whole time, less than 2 miles from our house. I thought about my grandfather's behavior over the years, trying to remember any signs that he might have been harboring such a terrible secret. Had there been clues I'd missed, moments when his carefully maintained facade had slipped? There's something else, Robert said, pulling out his notebook again. I've been tracking the timeline of the disappearances, and they all happened during a specific period, between October 1978 and November 1982. Then they just stopped. What happened in 1982, I asked. Your grandfather got married, Robert replied, to your grandmother. The killings stopped right around the time he brought a woman to live on the farm permanently. The implication was clear and horrifying. My grandfather had been killing young women until my grandmother's presence made it too risky to continue. She had unknowingly saved lives simply by moving into the farmhouse. But that raised another disturbing question. Had my grandmother known what was buried in the back field? Had she spent her entire marriage living above a cemetery, keeping a secret that would have destroyed everything she thought she knew about her husband? I pulled out my phone again, knowing I couldn't delay the inevitable any longer. But before I could dial, Robert Chen grabbed my arm. "Listen," he said urgently. In the distance, I could hear the sound of another vehicle approaching the farm. Chapter 9. The Confession. The pickup truck that pulled up belonged to my neighbor, Jim Morrison. He climbed out slowly, his weathered face grim as he took in the scene. My stuck tractor, the excavation, the flags scattered across the field, and Robert Chen standing beside me with his notebook of evidence. "I saw the cars from my property," Jim said quietly. "Figured it was time." Robert Chen stiffened beside me. "Time for what?" Jim walked closer, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He was 74 years old, had farmed the adjacent property his entire life, and had been my grandfather's closest friend. I'd known him since childhood, had helped with his harvest countless times. "Time to tell the truth about what happened in this field," Jim said, his voice heavy with decades of guilt. "I've been carrying this secret for over 40 years, and I'm tired of it." My heart began racing as the implications of his words sank in. "Jim, what are you saying?" He looked at Robert Chen with eyes full of pain and regret. "I'm saying I'm sorry for what happened to your daughter, and to the others. I'm sorry I didn't have the courage to stop it when I should have." Robert Chen took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists. "You knew? You knew what happened to Linda?" "I knew," Jim admitted. "Your grandfather and I both knew. We helped cover it up, and we've been living with that shame ever since." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. My grandfather hadn't been the killer. He'd been an accessory after the fact, but that still made him complicit in the deaths of 4 young women. "Who?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Who killed them?" Jim's face crumpled with grief and guilt. "My brother Danny. He was sick, had been since he came back from Vietnam. He'd have these episodes where he'd lose control completely. Your grandfather and I tried to get him help, but back then nobody understood PTSD. Nobody knew how to treat what the war had done to him. So you covered up murders instead?" Robert Chen's voice was filled with rage. "We thought we could control him," Jim said desperately. After each incident, Danny would be horrified by what he'd done. He'd beg us to help him, promise it would never happen again. We believed him because we wanted to believe him. What happened to him? I asked. He died in 1982, Jim replied. Car accident. Drove his truck into a tree at 90 miles an hour. Your grandfather and I always wondered if it was suicide, if he couldn't live with what he'd done anymore. Chapter 10. The Weight of Truth. The three of us stood in the field as Jim told us the full story of what had happened between 1978 and 1982. His brother Danny had been a decorated Vietnam veteran who'd returned home with severe psychological trauma that his family didn't understand and couldn't treat. Danny had lived in a trailer on Jim's property, isolated and increasingly unstable. The episodes started small, fits of rage, paranoid delusions, periods where he seemed to lose touch with reality completely. But they escalated over time, and eventually they turned deadly. The first girl was an accident, Jim said, tears streaming down his face. Danny thought she was a Viet Cong infiltrator. He was having a flashback, living in the past. By the time he realized what he'd done, it was too late. My grandfather had been the one to find Danny with Sarah Martinez's body. Instead of calling the police, he'd made the decision to protect his friend's brother. They'd buried her in the backfield and agreed to never speak of what had happened. We thought it was a one-time thing, Jim continued. We got Danny into therapy, put him on medication. For almost a year, he seemed to be getting better. Then it happened again. Each subsequent murder had followed the same pattern. Danny would have an episode, kill a young woman he encountered during one of his nighttime wanderings, then come to his brother and my grandfather in a state of complete breakdown. And each time, they'd made the decision to cover it up, rather than turn him in. We told ourselves we were protecting a war hero who'd sacrificed his sanity for his country, Jim said. We convinced ourselves that destroying his life wouldn't bring back the girls he'd killed, but really, we were just cowards. We were protecting ourselves and our families from the scandal. Robert Chen listened to the confession with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. My daughter was 19 years old, he said quietly. She wanted to be a nurse. She wanted to help people. And you buried her in a field like she was garbage. We gave them proper burials, Jim protested weakly. We said prayers, marked the locations. We didn't just dump them. You stole 43 years from my family, Robert replied. 43 years of wondering, of hoping she might still be alive somewhere. Do you have any idea what that did to my wife? She died still believing Linda might come home someday. The weight of the truth was crushing. My grandfather, the man I'd idolized, had been complicit in covering up multiple murders. He'd spent the last 40 years of his life guarding this terrible secret, living with the knowledge of what was buried in his field. Chapter 11. Justice at last. I called the FBI that afternoon, and within hours, the farm was swarming with federal agents, forensic specialists, and crime scene investigators. The backfield was cordoned off with yellow tape, and a full excavation began immediately. Over the next 3 days, they recovered the remains of 4 young women, exactly as Robert Chen had suspected. Linda Chen, Sarah Martinez, Jennifer Walsh, and Maria Santos, all victims of a damaged veteran's untreated trauma and the misguided loyalty of 2 men who thought they were protecting a friend. Jim Morrison was arrested and charged as an accessory after the fact to 4 counts of murder. At his age, he would likely spend the rest of his life in prison. He seemed almost relieved to finally be able to tell the truth after carrying the secret for so long. The story made national news, highlighting both the long-term effects of untreated PTSD and the devastating consequences of covering up crimes, even with good intentions. Victim advocacy groups used the case to push for better resources for families of missing persons and stronger penalties for those who obstruct justice. For Robert Chen, the discovery brought a mixture of closure and renewed grief. He finally knew what had happened to his daughter, but he also had to confront the reality that she'd been dead all along, buried just miles from where he'd spent decades searching for her. At least now I can bring her home, he told me, as we watched the forensic team carefully excavate Linda's remains. At least now she can have a proper burial with her family. The other families were contacted, and similar scenes of heartbreak and relief played out as parents and siblings learned the fate of daughters and sisters who had vanished decades ago. The pain was immense, but so was the relief of finally knowing the truth. As for me, I struggled with how to process the revelation about my grandfather. The man I'd loved and admired had made terrible choices that had caused immeasurable pain to multiple families. But I also understood that he'd been trying to protect a friend who was suffering from wounds that society didn't yet know how to heal. The farm felt different now, haunted by the knowledge of what had happened there. But I decided to keep it, to restore it properly, and to create a memorial garden where the backfield had been. It seemed like the right way to honor the memory of the 4 young women whose lives had been cut short. Thank you for listening to this difficult but important story. Sometimes the truth is buried deeper than we ever imagine, and it takes courage to uncover it, even when we know it will change everything we thought we knew about the people we love. The case of Linda Chen, Sarah Martinez, Jennifer Walsh, and Maria Santos reminds us that every missing person is someone's daughter, sister, or friend, and that families deserve answers no matter how much time has passed. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Please let me know what part of the world you're listening from, and share your thoughts about how we can better support both veterans dealing with trauma and families searching for missing loved ones. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing it with others. These stories matter, and telling them helps ensure that victims are remembered and that the truth, no matter how painful, eventually comes to light. Until next time, remember that some secrets are too heavy to carry alone, and that justice, even delayed, is still justice.